So data governance. Let me start by telling you a little bit about what we're going to go through together in the next 35 or so minutes. I'm going to start talking a little bit about myself. We'll then set up the stage by talking a little bit generally about what data governance is or is it not. And then I'll take you on a little road trip and an argument that it's the core of what I'm trying to tell you today, which hopefully will resonate and you will find interesting. It will be a little theoretical. But after that, I'll try to bring it down a level and think about, it's not just a theoretical argument. I'm going to be talking about things that I think they have practical application for how you do data governance within an organization. We'll look at a few examples, and then at the end, we'll just bring it all together and conclude. So let me get started talking a little bit about myself, not because I think it's particularly important or relevant, but because I come from a kind of like strange background into data, and I think that it's relevant for the presentation that I'll be giving you today, and a lot of the things that I'll be talking about, I think that you'll be able to connect to where I'm coming from. I am trained as a sociologist. I came to this country originally to do a PhD in sociology, and I worked as an academic for a few years. I was a professor of sociology and global studies, and about a decade ago, I decided to leave academia and go start working in industry. I worked first for a couple of startups in the fintech and gaming sectors. And about 4 years ago, I joined Brooklyn Data as a data consultant. And I've been there since then. It's where I am now. I am the director of data solutions at Brooklyn Data, and I'm the data governance practice lead there. And again, you'll see how there's all of these different elements of my background that will become relevant in the conversation as we move forward. But let's try to set up the stage about data governance. If somebody comes to us and has never heard about data governance, and they go and start Googling, what is this? What are we talking about here? They will find, or they will see, lots of different definitions. I'm putting a bunch here on screen. I don't need you to read, and we're not going to go through those in detail. But what I want to show is the diversity of what you find. And this is not me nitpicking. It's just like doing a general Google search and seeing what comes up. And you see things here, like it's a system of policies, it's a structured framework, a system of decision rights, a set of principles and practices, everything that you do to ensure the data is secure, private. There's lots of very diverse definitions out there. And the point that I'm trying to make here is not about having to pick one of these specifically to say that it's right or not, but to show that there's like a wide range of ways in which people are talking about data governance, right? And on the one hand, you find people that think that data governance is about everything that you do in data. So I'm showing you here the Dama wheel, in which basically data governance is at the core of everything that you do in data, and it touches everything from data infrastructure and architecture, security, data quality, lots of different things. On the other end, you find these definitions of data governance that are picking like a very thin sliver or slice of what data work is. So this particular one, talks about data governance having to do with data quality. Other people think about it in terms of security or others. But there's like a really huge range in which we talk about data governance. So the question is, where do we go from here? What do we do with this? I am going to put in front of you a couple of options. Option number one here is, this doesn't make any sense, right? Like if something means so many different things to different folks, there's really nothing to it. It's just like mumbo jumbo. It's data nonsense, data governance, data governanda. It doesn't really define or describe anything meaningful, and therefore we should just dismiss it, leave it aside. Let's focus on practical, concrete work that we can do, and let's not get into any of these conversations about data governance. That's one option. The other option on the blue door is, let's try to see if there's something to it. So let's not stay just with these very high-level generic definitions, but let's try to think about when people talk about the things that they do when they're doing data governance. When does it happen? What is in there? And then let's try to see if those things have anything in common that we can use to try to gain some new understanding about what it means to do data governance and how to do it. So what do I hear when we are at Brooklyn Data and we get our customers or clients coming to us and talking about things that they relate or that they can understand as related to data governance? What do they say? They say things like, we can trust our data. People are having disagreements about metrics within the company. We can't find or we don't have the things that we need to do our work. People have access to data and they see PII or things that they shouldn't see. We hear a lot about people talking about data silos. So lots of different things that they're talking about. And what I want to do now is a little bit of an exploration of what's behind this, what unifies this kind of work, and how can we use the insights from this exploration to do this work a little better. So let me start by talking a little bit about why people want data, right? Like people want data because they need to make decisions, and they need this data to inform these decisions in some way. So what I'm showing you here is like a very stylized representation of a data stack. So in a company, we need to do data work. We can do this in very many different ways, high-tech or low-tech. We can use Excel, or we can use state-of-the-art tools. But we basically have some sources of data. We ingest the data into some centralized repository. We transform it with some framework, or maybe manually in Excel. And then we use this data for downstream uses, for reporting, sometimes for ML or AI. We bring it back to operational tools to reverse ETL. Now, what we find a lot is that you can have a really good setup in this respect, great data stack, great data infrastructure. But when you need to be making those decisions, you find some problems there, right? So you have the data stack there on the far left. What you want to get is into the far right of the slide. You want to be able to make decisions that generate value for your organization. But what we see is that we often find some sort of disconnect. And these things that people are coming to talk to us are what generate this sort of disconnect, right? What we were talking about before, the data is of poor quality. People can't find the data that they need. There's people getting access to PII or data that they shouldn't see, etc. And so we need to figure out what is going on in here. And so the claim that I'm trying to make with all of this is that there seems to be something that we seem to consider as the core data work, right? We are tech people, we are thinking about the data stack, all of the amazing tools that we have been seeing in this conference and that we talk about all the time. But in a peripheral way, if you want, around this core data work, there is some other work, this peripheral work, that seems to be quite essential to produce and to generate value. That's why, we are in this business, and why we do at Brooklyn data governance work. We have people coming to us saying, we have a great stack, but we don't actually get value out of this data. Something is missing there. It's essential to deliver value, but it is hard to pin down. And therefore, all of these very disparate definitions of what it means to do this kind of work, of what it means to do data governance. So now is when, having set up the stage like this, I'm going to take you on this little road trip to the argument that I'm trying to make. And this is where things might be a little unusual for what you expect. As I was mentioning before, I used to be a professor of sociology. The way that I have thought about this a lot is by analogy to a classical sociological argument about theories that some of them are like 200 years old. And I don't want to scare you, but what I'm going to do now in this argument is try to walk you through this theoretical argument that I have spent a lot of time thinking about and teaching in the past, and try to make some points about it that I think are very directly relatable to the data world and that teach us something about how to do data governance. This theoretical argument has to do with the advent of mass markets in the production and consumption of commodities. Let me get started with this. So let's get like a very simple case. We're talking about before mass markets are a thing in the world. People are living in very localized societies. Producers and consumers have this direct relationship. The example I'm giving you here is people are producing coffee, but it can be any other commodity that you can think about. And the thing here is that this exchange that folks are having is the outcome of a personal or direct relationship, people who know each other. They live in the same village and they're exchanging this sort of product. The core thing about this is that they have some shared context in this direct relationship. That is, when I am producing this coffee or whatever commodity it is, I know who am I producing for. I know how much they need. I know how much they like to drink the coffee. I know what kind of coffee they like, how they like me to produce it. As the consumer, I can see directly how the people are producing this. In the modern world, it would be, are they using chemicals? Are they being treated fairly? Whatever it is that's happening in that context, I know it exactly what it is like because I have this personal, direct relationship with the producer. And this exchange is happening as an exchange of people within this direct relationship. Now, what happens when we move to the capitalist world with large-scale markets is that Scale and distance break this direct relationship, right? So what we find is a new world in which folks are producing very far away from their consumers, from the people who are going to consume their goods. And so I'm producing at this one end, I am making this coffee or whatever it is that I'm making, and when this gets to the consumer, it happens very far away. Could be at the very other end of the world, people who I have absolutely no direct personal relationship with. What this means is that there's like a new barrier between these two folks. The consumer here loses sight of the producer, doesn't have any sense of how they're producing and how they're doing things. And the context through all of that production is lost. What this means, and this is the core of these theories that I'm discussing here, is that a lot of this context is now basically, if you want, flattened into the product. So as a consumer, all I get access is to that product, that I can go to a supermarket and get it. And I can look at it and I can see that it has a price, it can have a certain quality, I can see the ingredients that it has in there. But all of those things, I attribute them to the product itself. It's the one thing that I am interacting with, the only thing that I know. And I lose sight that this product has this quality, has these ingredients, has this price, because of this whole production process that happened before. All of this context that before I could see as part of that relationship, but then now I have completely lost sight of. The point to make here is that with this, you basically have, there's a loss in the richness of that relationship. When I am interacting just via products, I lose all of that context. I lose all of that information that I had from that original relationship. And I attribute these things to the product, but I am losing things. It's not that everything about that context is present in the product in a way that I can read. And this is very evident nowadays, because even in this framework or in this context, we see us trying to make up for some of that loss of relationship. And this is what, for instance, certifications are like. When we go and we see that we buy something that has a label that tells us that it's organic or that it's fair trade, what that is doing is basically trying to bring back some of that context, give us some information about it. In a way, what we're doing is that we're augmenting the product with some metadata, if you want, about how it was produced. And I'm hoping that you can start seeing here where I'm going with this argument and how things are going to come together later on. Now, this is not only that, it's only happening to the producer. There's a symmetrical part here, sorry, to the consumer. There's a symmetrical part here that's happening to the producer. The producer is also in the dark here. They're producing this coffee at this point in time, but when I'm making it, I don't know, are people going to want what I'm producing? How much of it should I make it? What kind of characteristics and quality it should have? That is also lost when you don't have direct relationship to the people who are your customers, who are consuming from you. And they are also trying to do something to address that, right? So they do market research, for instance, to try to understand who are these consumers maybe at the other end of the world that I need to produce for. And in the other direction, they might try to do some marketing to project so that they can actually get folks to buy their products and to basically tell them about their context. And you see all of the advertisement about, all the values and how we produce and how we're doing things thinking for the consumer. So all of those things have to happen because we have lost that original relationship that we had before, and we're trying to, in a way, make up for it by you doing this other kind of work. That it's trying to bridge those gaps that we are now not that we're having because we don't have that direct relationship anymore. All right, so this is the first part of the argument. How all of the analogy to some theories that I have worked on quite a bit in the past that I think that tells us something about data. And that's when we're moving to talk about data, where I think that you can see a similar relationship there. Because for data, we have data producers and consumers within organizations. So let's imagine that we start in the world where all of these organizations are very small scale. Let's think of a startup, a few employees in there. This is something that I know very well from my past experience working in startups. And I was doing data work and sitting right next to the developer who was building the game that we were selling. And so I had a very direct relationship so that I could basically talk to this developer who was right next to me about what kind of data I needed to be able to do my work. And not only that, but because we were not very big, I was the one determining what was the shape of the data that had to be emitted so that I could do exactly the kind of analytics that I needed to be able to do for the game. So I had the telemetry that I needed and I could do the work. So we had this very close, direct relationship that made sure that the data that I was getting was of the right shape. And if there was any issue, it was immediate for me to address. I just needed to turn around and be able to talk to this developer about what we needed. Now, when organizations grow and develop, you start seeing again like a similar pattern as what we saw before, that there's more distance between the producers and the consumers of data. So I'm producing data in my operational tool, I might be in Salesforce or whatever, but that data might go down very many different steps until it reaches the data consumers at the end of the road. This data might have changed, it goes through different, it's a replica DB, and then it gets transformed in some way. And therefore, we find yourself again in a situation in which the breakage of that direct relationship means that you lose sight of how that data was produced, of what was the process that led to the data looking at that. And again, we find ourselves in this thinking when the data comes to me and I say, the data has these problems, right? It's the data that has the quality problem, it's the data that is showing PII, whatever it is. The argument again here is that yes, we are thinking about this in terms of the data, something that needs to be fixed in the data. But at the origin of this problem comes this lack of relationship, this divide that has come up from scale and distance. And as before, something is lost from all of this, right? So that's what leads to I get the data and then I don't understand, I get confused, I get frustrated because the data that I receive doesn't do what I need and what I expect. And sometimes I don't even know how to get around getting it better. Like I can complain, I know that there's all of these issues, but I don't know who the data producer is. I don't know who those folks are, why the data looks the way that it does, because I have lost sight of that. Same as we talked about before. There's a symmetrical aspect here. The producers themselves are also blind about how the data is being used downstream. Many of them don't know. They're using the data in Salesforce as the way that they need for the work that they do, and they're very busy, and they have no sense that somebody downstream is going to use this data for something that because I make a change that in my mind makes complete sense for the work that I'm doing is going to wreak havoc downstream. So there's also some blindness and some problems that are happening at the other end of the spectrum. Same as we saw before, we try to do things to try to address these issues, right? We augment the data with metadata to try to bring back some of this context. We do other things, data contracts, we'll talk about it a little bit more later on, to try to bridge that gap, to try to make sure that even if we have lost that relationship, we get some of that information, some of that context that is lost, so that we can continue doing our data work in the most effective way. The point still being that this is something that we're doing as we have already lost something meaningful and important, and we're just trying to basically address some of these issues that have come up. So to try to summarize all of this little road trip that I have taken you on, the idea here is that we tend to see the distance and scale increasing, organizations grow, evolve. And when this happens, the relationship between producers and consumers tends to fade away. We lose sight of each other. We lost that kind of direct connection that we had when we were in a smaller scale. And then we end up focusing on the product or the data in this case to try to address the problems, right? The data has a quality problem. And when we're doing that, we're trying to improve things because we need to do our data work. But the point here is that we have lost something meaningful, something fundamental. That shared context, that mutual understanding, that trust has been lost. And that has real implications for the work that we do and some of the problems that we go to a consultant later on to try to help us address in our day-to-day data work. And the argument that we make is that all of those different things that I was mentioning before, that a client comes to us telling us, we have a problem of data quality, we have a problem with our metadata, we have a problem with whatever it is, that all of those can be understood in a way as some of these relationship problems, right? So that there is something common there that if we could try to focus and address, we might be able to make up for, and we might be able to redress some of these issues that we attribute to the data itself and that come from some of these lost relationships that we talked about before. So at the core of my argument here, what I'm trying to say is, data governance is about this gap that you have. So it's not the data itself. When we focus only on the data, and that's not to say that data is not important and that we don't need to do things to redress the problems of the data, but that in some ways is downstream from understanding that there is a problem of a relationship, of that gap. It's that gap that we need to try to address. And if we focus on that, we'll do a much better job at having better data and being able to do data work in a much more meaningful and effective and efficient way. So this is the core of the argument. Now I want to try to convince you that this has some applications in how we actually do data governance work or data work more generally, and to show you some examples of things that we have done that I think that draw from the learnings from here. And the first point I want to make here is, this is something that also when I was an academic, I encountered all the time, which is I would work with these really brilliant graduate students who would come to me with these great theoretical arguments, right? And you will listen to them and think, oh, this is really interesting. This makes a lot of sense. There's like some light bulb lights up, and you think that they are onto something. But the key question always was, so what? Everything that I have said so far, it sounds good, but if it doesn't have any real implications, and if it doesn't let you think about your actual data work and you can do something with it in a meaningful way, it's, again, it's interesting, but it doesn't really lead to anything practical. Now, the so what here, I think that the way in which we can start thinking about this, what points the way in the right direction is by thinking about the limits of the analogy. Like all analogies at some point, they stop working anymore because they're not perfect. And there's many ways in which the analogy that I said before might fall apart. But the one point that I want to emphasize here is that in the first example, we're talking about markets. And in the second one, we're talking about something that happens within organizations. And those are very different contexts. Within markets, the scale and the distances are enormous, like global markets, like millions and millions of potential customers that you can have in that respect. So trying to redress those sorts of relationships that we were talking about before between production and consumer, it requires a lot of effort. That goes against market forces in general, and that has big trade-offs, right? Like, yeah, I can have direct contact with the person that I'm buying from, but that means that I lose from diversity, I might lose on price, I might lose on lots of other things that I might be able to get if I actually buy from global markets. Very hard to do. That doesn't mean that it's not possible. Like, we see plenty of examples of this happening. There's all of these movements to buy local, to know your farmer, in which people are trying to actually regain some of those direct relationships between producers and consumers. But again, a much harder thing to do, much more likely to become something very minoritary and not something that we can change or can do a lot in a systemic way. Now, for data, when we're thinking about work that we do within organizations, that looks a little different. Scale, it can be big. Some companies are really huge, but it's not as overwhelming. We have, in general, within an organization, common ultimate goals. So it's not individuals that are completely independent, living their own lives. It's folks who are working together to achieve a common objective. We have a hierarchical organization, so we actually tell people what to go and do, and we have a hierarchy in which we can make things happen in a concerted way, in a way that you cannot do within markets. And we have direct communication channels, right? So we have our Slacks or our emails or all hands or whatever meetings that are set up in the company. So we have all of these tools of organizations in which we might be able to do something about trying to address those gaps that I was talking about before that are so central to this kind of work. How do we do that? I am claiming here that I think that, I'm not sure if it's the right way, but one way that I find very useful to think about this is in terms of feedback loops. Feedback loops as these reciprocal processes, right? The key thing is that there is like a signal return. So it's not just that I say something, but that there's a return that comes back to me. And it's by completing that return that I can hear the feedback, and then I can adjust, we can align, we can make sure that we learn from it and that we move forward in a concerted way, in a way that we work together. So the core of what we'll need to do is try to think about these feedback loops within an organization that will help us make these reconnections between producers and consumers of data. That's the core of where I'm going with this. Now, the first caveat that I want to talk about this is that this sounds great in theory, but in practice, when we have like this scale that we were talking about, this increases complexity. And with complexity, costs come as well, right? So as an organization starts growing and growing and there's more people, there's more and more of these potential relationships that we might want to address. And that's untenable. You cannot just make sure that everyone within a large organization has this direct relationship so that you can make sure that you are going back to the world of the old startup where you can, talk to your colleague next to you with everybody on the organization. So when I'm talking about this rebuilding of these feedback loops, what we next need to do basically is to be very selective and be able to identify which of these relationships are worth investing in, because they're going to have these benefits downstream on how we manage data and how we prevent some of these data problems that we were discussing before. So that's the first point, which selectively identifying the loops that we need to work on. What does it mean to work on these feedback loops? What do you do in practice? I like to think about these feedback loops in 3 types of dimensions. The first one, I call it closure. The idea that you need to make sure that when you're having these relationships between folks that you have identified before, there has to be complete closure of this loop. If I provide some feedback, but that never reaches back to the person that can act on it, then it's wasted effort. It doesn't get to anything meaningful that is going to change in your organization. So the first thing is making sure that those loops are closed. The second one is latency. That's basically the length, if you want, of the feedback loop. I can have a closed loop of these meetings that I have with my data producers once every 3 months. Well, I have a data problem now that I need to address this week so that I can have these reports that are necessary to make a decision. I cannot wait 3 months to solve this problem. So how do you shorten these loops so that these feedbacks are happening faster and faster? That's the second dimension that you can think about, the work that you can do there. Third one, bandwidth. How much information, how thick basically are these feedback loops? I can say, my dashboard is broken. Well, what do I do with that? And I think that all of us probably have encountered that at one point or another, right? I need more information to be able to act on it. So how do we ensure that when there's these feedback loops, we are actually getting the type of information that is actionable and that allows us to do something about it? And thinking about these things really help us try to understand what kinds of actions we can do in trying to rebuild some of these feedback loops so that we can prevent some of these data problems that we were talking about before. Now, the point that I want to make now to conclude this section is that when we are working with organizations and we're seeing how folks are trying to address some of these problems that they come to us, a general pattern that we usually see is that folks are focusing on the technology, right? We have a problem for data quality, let's bring in an observability tool. People don't know where to find the data, let's bring a data catalog. And I have absolutely nothing against those. I think that some of those tools are amazing, and I think that we should use them. But when the focus is on the tool itself and we're losing sight of those relationships that those tools can help enhance, then we are running into those sorts of problems in which these tools don't actually make a difference. And I'll provide some examples of that later on. So the claim that I'm making is that we should move from a focus on technology to a focus on managing the gap, which doesn't mean that we're not doing the technology. We need to manage those relationships, try to rebuild them in some ways. And technology will be a key factor, but it's not the core of the solution, I would argue. How do we manage this gap? What kinds of things we need to do? I'll provide some examples again in a second, but you can do things like try to establish communities, create rituals so that people have to interact with each other. So we're fostering these interactions, people having to talk with each other in one way or another. We can develop a shared language so that we don't have people dealing with Salesforce and people who are in the data team that they don't even know how to talk about each other, about what they need. And so there is a lot of work to be done here, meaningful work, data work, but there is not like the classical technical data work that we are used to, thinking about folks who know how to manage their tools very well. But they require rebuilding these kinds of relationships. And again, I don't want technology to disappear from here. Technology, in a way, kind of like enhances each one of those. And good tools, I think, are the ones that help you with this. And you can see that. I think that there's a lot of the data catalogs out there that do a lot of this. For instance, they allow you to have a conversation about those data assets that you are adding in there, that they will link to the Slacks or Teams or whatever, so that you can actually have those feedback loops that are closed and that they provide information. They try to give you the context that you really need to be able to make decisions about those data assets. So the tools are very important, but you need to think about them in the context of what is about these relationships that you're trying to fix, and how can you use the tools to enhance them. To conclude not to conclude, but to bring all of this to an even more practical sense of how that happens, I have prepared a few examples about cases or things that we have seen in the work that we do at Brooklyn Data that I think are exemplifying what I'm saying in terms of like building these feedback loops as key to try to prevent some of these problems that we tend to associate with data governance. The first one of these examples is the one that I call the unused data governance tool. This one is kind of like a composite, if you want, because we see this a lot. But the point here is that the problem that we see in general is that things like bad data keeps breaking our dashboards, right? And we need to do something about this. So we have seen companies that come to us with this, and they have already tried to do something about this, and they've gotten a data observability tool. What we find, I have one specific case in mind, but we see this quite a bit, is that after the setup, the tool is not used. What happens is they spent all of this time and all of this money setting it up, put a bunch of alerts to try to be very thorough about everything that can break. And what happens is that these alerts start to go off. They don't have the resources, they don't have one person who's responsible for dealing with those. Even if there is one person, they don't know what to do with this, they don't know who the data producer is. And what ends up happening is that this becomes noise. All of these alerts keep going off, and nobody's acting on them. And so there's not very much that value that folks are getting out of those tools. This is in no way a dig on a data observability tool. I think that all of the tools that these companies were using were great, but they were missing some of the work that they needed to do to get value out of those tools, to enhance these processes, to bring back these feedback loops. So what we did in this case is like, use tooling as an amplifier to reestablish these channels for meaningful, timely, reciprocal feedback. I'm not going to give you at this point the specific things we did, because I'm going to distract you just by reading what I have in the slide. But what I want to bring up generally is that the way to do this is basically setting up processes. What we were talking about before, setting up communities, rituals, interactions that allow to make these processes work better. So for instance, making sure that you're getting producers and consumers in a room to think about what are those key loops, what are those key alerts that they are going to break something really meaningful, that we need to do something about this. And have a process and have people responsible so that when these alerts go off, what's going to happen? How can we communicate timely? How we can communicate in a way in which the correct information gets to the person who can act on it? How do we follow up on the process so that it's not that we just told you that this is broken, but that we have regular touch points and we have SLAs maybe even, in which we know that we need to address this issue in this amount of time because it has this amount of security. It's all of this basically relationship work, if you want, or relational work that leads to the success of using this data tool. The problem was not with the tool, it's not that the tool was not the right way of dealing with this issue, it's that you didn't do the work that was underpinning requiring that data tool, and so the tool itself was not fixing the issue in that way. And again, if folks are interested in seeing the slides, you can see all of this in more detail, but I'm running out of time. I want to make sure that I go through my examples, and I'm going to rush through the next one. The second one, I call it the friendly analyst. And this one, I find it interesting because it basically means we didn't really have to do very much for this specific case to try to solve the problem. Let me set it up for you here. This was a problem of a company that actually did have a robust, I think, and good in general data governance program, right? But they had the issue that business users couldn't find the data that they needed, or they just didn't use it. So they set up this data catalog. They had this data governance analyst populating the data catalog. But even after doing that, they continue having lack of engagement and use of data and data tools. Now, the interesting thing is that this company came to us not asking for direct help with consulting help trying to do something with this. They were looking for a specific profile of people, because what they had found is that they had this one friendly analyst. So they had one data governance analyst that dealt with a bunch of business units, and each one of them had a bunch of business units themselves. So they had 4 or 5 of those. There was one of them for whom this problem wasn't happening. Was not somebody who was better technically, not somebody who was smarter than everybody else, but what they did realize is that that one person was doing all of this relational work. This was somebody who was going to the business users, asking questions, bringing them into meetings with the data team, setting up rituals in meeting regularly to try to ask the right questions, putting things in contact with each other, trying to understand what was being put in the data catalog, providing training to the data producers so that they could get the context and get more information on why getting the data catalog with the right information was meaningful. And this person was incredibly successful in getting the business units that he was working with to actually do the right work. And what this client was coming to us was like, do you have somebody else like this guy that can actually help us do all of this? And so again, like, this is not work that you have to do anything out of the ordinary, but I think that the important or the meaningful thing for me about this is that this is core, I think, for data work, right? Like, we tend to focus on the data warehouse or the DBT code or whatever it is. But if we want to be successful data leaders, we need to do this really, I think, meaningful relationship work, because it's what's going to make those tools and all of that technical work successful, so that we can make those decisions that create value. I'm just going to skip then quickly, because I have only a couple of minutes, to the third example that I call silos galore. This one is a little different, but I think it was meaningful because you will also see that the solution that we provided to this was in some ways very simplistic. This was a case in which it's a customer or a client whose customer data was scattered across multiple systems. They had grown through acquisitions, which we see a lot. And these are the people who come to us like, our data is a mess. We have, 10, 11 ERPs. We have, our customer data is scattered in lots of different systems, and it's a mess. People are not talking to each other. The customer data, from different systems doesn't have the same IDs. We don't even have a clear definition of the customer. So pretty meaningful problems that require a long time to get a solution here. What they had done so far was that each team would try to make their own fixes. They needed to be able to do work, so each one of those different units would try to fix the problem for themselves. And that, solved some things in the short run, but in the long run, it was making things harder, because there was even more fragmentation. There were tools that were specific for different teams, so it was compounding the problem in the long run. The solution that we did here, basically, is we understand that there's like some high-level problem that it's going to take a long time, so that you can, when there's a new customer, you populate all the systems with the same ID. There's a lot of work that needs to happen there. But that couldn't happen when people were not even talking to each other, and they were focusing on their individual problem. So what we did, and this was in the broader context of trying to build a customer 360, but what we did is like, let's bring the data from these different systems together and build a easy dashboard that tries to, at the same time that we're trying to build this customer 360, that surfaces these disconnects that there's between the data and different folks. And let's try to put together these processes that make people have to talk to each other and to handle those disconnects, so that we can surface that there's this disconnect. Then these people need to meet every week and discuss about why is there this disconnect, why is this what's happening in your system not matching what I have in my system. fix it in the short run so that we can have good data for the customers, because we need to do business right now. We cannot wait a year to solve the problem upstream. But the important thing here, I think, is that when they were actually doing this relationship work and started talking to each other, they started the process, the discussion, so that they can do the higher level, if you want, or more foundational work that they need to do that will take much longer time. But now they have a foundation to do it because they're talking to each other. They understand what their common problems are, and they are already having these rituals, this community through which they can start this other work. And they have now another project in which they're building on these relationships to do that. So again, it's not that we solved the real problem. It's not that we did something that technically was very complicated, but we set up the foundations by rebuilding these relationships so that they could actually do the work in the long run and fix those issues. So I'm basically out of time. So if we want to have like a couple minutes for questions, all I'm going to do is basically just summarize here. So again, the point, I'm hoping that you can see why I'm saying that data governance is not the governance of data. And that's a little bit chicken tongue. It's more about, data governance is not just the governance of data, that there's more to it. But the key point is that data is important, but it's the product of social processes, which you need to keep in mind. That data work needs to focus and nurture these relationships. Again, it might not be the sexy technical work that all of us like to do, but it's important if you want to be successful doing data work. That the key needs to be into managing these gaps between producers and consumers through these feedback loops, and that technology is really important, but the role of technology in data governance is like fostering more of these relationships so that these data governance activities can be much more successful. So I'll leave it here. Thank you so much for your attention.